A warning. This podcast contains descriptions of sexual and family violence and self-harm, which some listeners may find disturbing. You can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or the domestic violence hotline 1-800-RESPECT. 3 months after Martin and Susan Johnson were found guilty of sexually abusing their daughter Emily, they took their seats in the dock of the New South Wales District Court to listen to her read her victim impact statement. Then the Johnsons noticed someone unexpected but familiar walk into the courtroom and take a seat. It was Dave Miller, their former friend, the police officer they'd turned to nearly 7 years earlier when Emily first reported being sexually assaulted overseas by a sports coach. Susan Johnson remembers being puzzled why he was there in court, dressed in plain clothes, because Miller hadn't played any official role in the case. Other police had investigated Emily's allegations about that overseas rape and the horrific accusations that she had later made against her parents.
And I was just completely confused. He wasn't in his police uniform. I was just stunned that he was there because no one else was there to represent. My mum wasn't. So no friends were there that had supported my daughters, so that you would have maybe expected. So I was very shocked to see him walk in and very confused at that stage.
Months later, after the Johnsons had been sentenced and sent to jail, Emily posted a photo online of herself skydiving with Dave, who was recently separated from his wife. Later that same year, as her parents were preparing their appeals, she and Dave turned up together for a family gathering at her aunt's house, and they were photographed toasting champagne. By then, Emily had broken off her engagement to her boyfriend and moved into Dave's home, telling relatives she was helping to look after his dogs. Then came photos of them camping together and hugging each other close on the ski slopes. Some of Emily's former friends in the sports world were shocked, and not just because Dave was old enough to be her father. I'm Richard Guilliatt, and this is Shadow of Doubt, Episode 8, Truth. When their daughter Emily had reported being raped overseas as a 17-year-old, there was only one police officer that Martin and Susan Johnson thought about going to see. Dave Miller had known the family since Emily was in her early teens. His kids had been her friends. Susan Johnson recalls that when Emily was in high school, Miller had showed her around a forensic facility because she was fascinated by police work. Emily seemed to develop a certain bond with him. When her roommates on that overseas trip had first reported their suspicions about a team coach, she had rung Miller to get his advice. And when she later accused that coach herself and said she'd been raped, it was Miller who recommended she go see Donna, the sexual assault counsellor who helped Emily recover her memories of her father's abuse. Emily's former boyfriend, Sam, had told me that it was Dave Miller who'd found out about Martin Johnson's dubious history as a schoolteacher, and that information had been pivotal to the case because it helped trigger Emily's memories of her father's violent abuse. Susan Johnson remembers that when she found out Emily and their police friend were a couple, it both shocked her and made a strange kind of sense.
I did know there was something very strange about their relationship. Something had been really bothering me throughout, but I did not expect that when I found out. At the beginning, he was just a really good family friend, and I coached his children, and he seemed very supportive of my family and my daughter. But it was when she went to overseas and that alleged rape had happened, I realised the interaction, with him was far greater than that she'd actually phoned him before she phoned her own parents to to tell him about things that had happened over there. And then when she was put in mental health, he was visiting on his own, and when she escaped and, we found her on the bridge, he was there, he was at the scene again in plain clothes. So there was all these strange signals that were just very odd, very, very odd when I think back on it now. He was a police officer at the time when I took my daughter to give her first statement about what had happened overseas. And I think he was fully aware of the case. I can't help but wonder about how much impact that had, So I have a real problem with the fact that they became a couple, and also the age difference. It's as a mother, and I just wonder of his interest in my daughter being so young and so mentally unwell. What his interest was in her.
Emily and Dave would leave their old community after their relationship became official and move elsewhere in the state. They were destined to be a couple for only 4 years, but it caused ripples among Dave's colleagues and friends. Emily's former boyfriend, Sam, was among those who found it strange. His parents had been close friends with Dave up until that time, and Sam himself dropped out of contact with Emily. Their relationship had ended before the Johnsons' trial, and sometime after that, Sam found out Emily was telling people that he too had sexually assaulted her.
I didn't hear about the allegation until a fair bit later, and I can't remember who heard it from. And I sort of went, I think I know about the incident she's talking about.
So you found out she's telling other people that you sexually assaulted her? Yeah. According to Sam, the allegation stemmed from an incident when he and Emily had had sex, and she had said afterwards, "We shouldn't have done that. I wasn't feeling up to it." To Sam, it had been consensual. Emily evidently believed he'd missed her signals. He said the bad feelings from that episode had contributed to the end of their relationship. When I heard about this, I thought Sam might have developed a sceptical view of Emily. But like a lot of people in the Johnsons' local community, he accepts her story of what was going on in the family.
Like, it didn't bother me as far as going, maybe she's lying the whole time. That's definitely not the case, in my opinion anyway. Yeah, and I can see how people do have the opinion that, there's a fair bit of fabricated stuff there, but I just can't put it with the experience I had with her. I can't put it down to that.
For me, the strangest thing about Dave Miller's behaviour was that I'd seen it before, in a case that bore some eerie similarities. In the mid-1990s, a married couple from the northern suburbs of Sydney were prosecuted after their 18-year-old daughter began recovering memories of sadistic abuse, which she said she'd suffered for 13 years. Like Emily, she accused her father of violently raping her from the age of 5, and she remembered multiple adults abusing her, including her elderly grandmother, who was also charged. Her brother and her 14-year-old sister also began making allegations against the parents, and then a younger sister and nieces and nephews. There were allegations of weird rituals involving blood being taken from their bodies. It grew into a major police operation until the couple's 3 youngest children admitted they had fabricated stories of abuse under pressure from counsellors or police. After the case was thrown out of court, the mother and grandmother were awarded $165,000 compensation for false imprisonment. And during those civil proceedings, the parents had learned that their oldest daughter, the one whose memories had started the case, was now living with the detective who'd run the investigation. The young woman's allegations had so disturbed him that he'd consulted a psychologist who had warned him he was getting over-involved. The lawyer who represented that family was Greg Walsh, a veteran Sydney criminal solicitor who is well versed in the psychiatric literature on memory and trauma. He's been warning for years about the potential for police, counsellors and even prosecutors to become emotionally enmeshed in child abuse cases. 7 months after the Johnsons were jailed, he agreed to take on Susan Johnson's appeal pro bono. The couple were both deeply unhappy with the way their lawyers had conducted the trial, and on reading the transcript, Greg Walsh says he understood why. He couldn't fathom why witnesses such as the psychiatrist Dr. John Roberts had not been called to give evidence.
It was fundamental that Dr. Roberts give evidence. I spoke to Dr. Roberts, and to this day is deeply troubled about the case. The other aspect is this, that the complainant was mentally ill. She suffered from very serious mental health conditions which directly impacted and affected her reliability. The treating psychiatrist, one of the senior counsel, I think, asked her a page of questions, less than 5 minutes. That was absolutely vital evidence that should have been the subject of cross-examination, because suffering from, for instance, conditions such as psychosis or borderline personality disorder, and there's a variety of conditions that can impact upon reliability, can explain someone coming to a belief that they've been sexually abused when they have not. Now, that was not canvassed. Now,
Walsh planned to appeal on the basis that the lawyers had been deficient. But in a repeat of what had happened at the trial, the appeal would undergo a sudden change of lawyers and tactics. Greg Walsh had to bow out due to his workload, and legal aid teams were appointed for both the Johnsons. The appeal, when it was filed, mentioned no criticism of the legal aid team who had conducted the trial. I can't tell you exactly why that happened, because the appeal lawyers didn't want to talk about it. But it's well known among criminal lawyers that appeal judges are reluctant to make a finding of incompetence against defence counsel unless there is unassailable evidence. Trial lawyers make all sorts of tactical decisions that an appeal judge might be wary of second-guessing. And in the Johnsons' case, their former solicitor had signed an affidavit saying his clients had approved everything he did, that he was acting under instructions. If those instructions were written down, I never found them, but it seems the Johnsons' appeal team decided to avoid that issue. They appealed on the basis that Susan Johnson should have received a separate trial, that the prosecution should have called Dr. Maria Nittis, the forensic medical expert, that Emily's evidence was bizarre and implausible, and that the appeal judges should consider the repressed memory evidence which the Johnsons' trial lawyers had not presented to the jury. You might recall we covered in the last episode how the Johnsons' lawyers tried to convince the jury that Emily and her sister were simply lying. I attended the appeal hearing, which was held in the high-ceilinged Banco Court on the top floor of the New South Wales Supreme Court. The Chief Justice, Tom Bathurst, sat in crimson robes and wig at the centre of the bench, flanked by Justice Elizabeth Fullerton and Justice Desmond Fagan. Martin and Susan Johnson appeared on large video screens above the judges, watching proceedings from dismal windowless rooms in their jails. Shortly after the hearing began, a stooped figure took a seat in the public gallery near me and appeared to doze off. He was Susan Johnson's new solicitor. The appeal did not go well. The Chief Justice said he failed to see why the prosecution had been obligated to call Dr. Nittis, given that she'd written her report for the defence. He said the repressed memory material was not new evidence because it had all been available at the time of the trial, and the Johnsons' lawyers may have had good reasons not to table it. Watching the Johnsons try to follow all this remotely from prison, I wondered if they were experiencing a dreadful sense of déjà vu. It would be 10 months before the judges released their findings, And I remember that day because I received a distressing phone call from the Johnsons' daughter, Rebecca. She had found the decision online before I did, and she was struggling to understand it because it was more than 150,000 words long. She seemed to believe that the appeal had been successful, but as I hastily scanned through the judgment on my phone, I had to tell Rebecca the truth, that her parents' appeal had failed on all counts, and she broke down.
Oh yeah, this has to be fought. This is just, I just knew it would take more. It's just not right. None of it's ever been right, and it's just so controlled of facts that don't even exist.
Look, I don't know what to say.
I just can't believe it. Do anything with Mum, because if they do, then they have to do it like Dad goes. She's just. So there's still a lot of hope, hey? I think this has to break open, and I can't, Richard, I can't anymore sit back. This never happened, and I don't know what else to do. And these guys have kept my parents in jail, and today, and I just can't sit back anymore. When I sat there, I just thought, how can this be happening? This doesn't even make sense to me either.
It's a unanimous judgment from what I can tell. But it's just, I'm afraid you got another battle to fight now, unfortunately. You
know what, though, Richard, this hasn't been right. Like, my parents are suffering in there, and I don't know how much longer they're going to last. And they're innocent, and they're still in jail, and they just had their appeal rejected. And there's nothing I can do about it right now, but the fact is, the truth is sitting there, and it has to come out. And if it takes longer, it takes longer, and I promise myself that that's what it takes.
I was wrong about the appeal judgment. It wasn't unanimous. Justice Desmond Fagan had written a 17,000-word dissent in which he said there had been a miscarriage of justice, that it was improbable Emily Johnson could have suffered such inhuman abuse and thought it was normal, and then remembered dozens of incidents of sexual assault in such extraordinary detail. The judge said there was a real possibility that Emily's father had committed sexual assaults which were less serious, and his daughter's memories had become distorted by her psychiatric issues. Justice Fagan's opinion had been outvoted by his two fellow judges, but his findings seemed to give the Johnsons a foot in the door at the High Court. 4 years had passed between the Johnsons' guilty verdict and their rejected appeal. But in the interim, something had happened that shifted my view of the case. 2 months after the appeal decision, I was contacted out of the blue by a woman I'll call Fiona. She had once been a student of Martin Johnson's in high school. She'd heard I was looking into his case, and she wanted to tell me about her experiences with him 30 years earlier, when she was a 16-year-old schoolgirl. This is another part of the story that I can't tell in detail for legal reasons. But what I can say is that Fiona described how Johnson, when he was teaching her, had pressured and cajoled her into having sex with him, both on and off the school grounds. She told me how skillfully he engineered situations for them to meet, even at her home and his own home. How brazen he was in introducing her to his wife Susan. That had gone on into year 12, until Johnson suddenly left the school. Fiona remembered that time as enormously confusing. The secrecy, the suspicions of her friends, and the deceiving of her parents. She told me that when she started thinking about it recently, details had flooded back, more than she wanted to remember. She said they were the crappiest 2 years of her life. I look back at it now and I'm so angry, she told me. I can't fathom how I let it happen. But he was incredibly confident. He had this ability to make you feel that you were the one in the wrong. Fiona's account matched what other students had told police. But what really concerned me was that her experience had happened 5 years after Martin Johnson was first accused and forced out of a teaching job. which meant he'd persisted with his offending even after he got caught. Johnson wouldn't talk about any of this in detail over a prison phone, even though he denied the misconduct. But Fiona's account made me look at him very differently and question what I was doing. A few months earlier, the film producer Harvey Weinstein had gone to prison, and Believe Women had become a global rallying cry. Did I want to be a man presenting a podcast that raised doubts about a woman's story of abuse if I wasn't even sure myself what I believed? On top of that was an ethical dilemma. I'd made it clear to the Johnsons from the beginning that I was obligated to report the story as I saw it. But still, I knew they'd come to see me as someone who was on their side. What if the podcast didn't turn out that way and they felt that I'd betrayed them? So I decided to drop the story, which sparked another upsetting conversation with their daughter, Rebecca.
Hey, how you going?
Yeah, look, I'm okay. Look, I've got bad news for you. I got a call from a woman who claims to be one of the people that your father acted inappropriately with, and this isn't
Another high school student, or?
Yeah, well, a different school from the other one, and no.
There's no easy way to tell someone you think their father was a predator. And this conversation went downhill pretty quickly, because Rebecca angrily refused to concede that her father could have done anything wrong. She said she believed his explanations, that all these allegations from his time as a teacher were blown out of proportion. And even if he had behaved inappropriately, it had nothing to do with why her parents were in prison.
My parents didn't do anything, Richard, to my daughter, my sister and my family or me. So this is another thing that's coming up that someone's accusing him of. It's got nothing to do with the fact that my parents should have not be found guilty. During that trial, I understand you're not willing to publish anything. All right, that's fine. Yeah. I still am, and I will fucking be going for it, and I am pursuing it, and no one will stop me. Do you understand? Because he did not do these things, he should not be in jail. And when he comes out...
The discussion went on like that for quite a while, and it gave me a bit more to think about. Was Rebecca really so convinced that her father was innocent? And her mother, Susan, how could she have been oblivious to what was going on during her husband's years as a teacher? They did sound at times like two people who were in denial, unable to admit that even a glimmer of what Emily and Sarah had alleged might be true. But then, if Martin Johnson really had been abusing his daughters, why had he agreed to send Emily to a psychologist when she was 15? And if his wife was involved or covering it up, why did she take Emily straight to police and a sexual assault counsellor after she reported being raped overseas? And what about all the evidence that completely contradicted Emily and Sarah's account of their family? I'd resolved to drop the story, but the truth was, it just kept rattling around in my head. I kept thinking about the buried tools and Emily's diary and why she had taken so long to tell police about those vital pieces of evidence. It was hard to believe that her father had brutally tortured her with those tools for years without anyone noticing. So why were they buried? And how had Emily known where to find them? Could she have buried them as a kid for other reasons and was now remembering that differently? I went back to those secretly recorded phone calls, the ones I can't play you, and heard again how the Johnsons sounded, like two bewildered people caught in a nightmare. And whenever Susan Johnson called me from prison, I became convinced all over again that she was telling the truth. 18 months after their appeal failed in New South Wales, the High Court refused to hear their case, saying it raised no general principles of law. The following day, my phone rang and I saw the number for Susan Johnson's prison. She'd heard about the court decision from Rebecca, not from her lawyer. He hadn't contacted her. How are you feeling?
Just just shocked, really. I'm not 100% shocked, with what's happened, but I guess I just have no faith left in the justice system or lawyers. So, all I've got left is belief in myself and the truth now. I just need, honesty and hope. Well, I'm never going to give up hope because I just have to believe that the truth will set us free at some point. It's just the time and the reality of having to be in this horrific place for still years to come is just very confronting. I'm sorry, I'm close to tears today. I'm not normally.
She explained that it had been Emily's birthday the week before, and she had been thinking of her and everything that had happened to the family. So it had been a bad week. I could hear another inmate screaming in the background, but Susan Johnson kept talking about hope and truth and how it kept her going.
And again, just truth. I think when you have truth and you've done nothing wrong and you have belief, that's your fundamental belief as a child, that's what you rely on. Because in this place, when everything is so horrible, that's all you've got. You've only got yourself. And I have that. I can look in these mirrors, well, they're not really mirrors, they're not just reflecting things. And I can look back at that person because I've done nothing wrong. But still, someone has to get to the bottom of this.
So, of course, I didn't drop the story. The High Court decision meant that all the documents from the case could be released by the Johnsons' lawyers. The files I'd seen previously hadn't included all of Emily's treatment records. And there were so many documents, I hadn't had the time to get through it all. So last year, I took delivery of 16 boxes of documents and spent a couple of months sifting through them page by page. The treatment records were a mess. They were filed out of chronological order, many without dates. I could see how the trial lawyers had struggled to even get their head around it all. But buried in there were shards of information that caught the eye. It turned out that Emily had spoken to her counsellor Donna about Bill Newman, the swimming coach who had molested her sister Sarah when he lived with the family. There was a note from Donna which said, "Discussed sexual assault by swimming coach." It was unclear what that meant, but an unsigned hospital report from around the same time referred to Emily disclosing abuse by significant males in her life. Males, plural. And whoever wrote that had at first used a different phrase, father figures. So it appeared Emily had disclosed abuse by a significant male or father figure other than Martin Johnson. Of course, it was impossible to know exactly what that meant or what else might be revealed by the thousands of pages of treatment records that had never been released. I had tried more than once to get Emily or Sarah to tell me their side of the story, but they refused to speak to me. It bothered me, even though I'd read all their statements and ploughed through 3,500 pages of court transcript. I hadn't actually spoken to Emily herself, or even the family members who supported her. The split in the Johnson family had never healed. On one side, the parents were supported by their children, Rebecca and Daniel, and by Martin Johnson's father and sister. On the other side were Emily and Sarah and their maternal grandmother and aunt. The only person Emily or Sarah had reached out to was Daniel, but those conversations had always ended in angry recriminations because he simply didn't believe his sisters. Daniel had told me he actually had few fond memories of his father, whose anger had made him frightened and who had once thrown him into a bush and cut his head. But watching his parents led off to prison had been a trauma that had taken him years to deal with.
From everything I experienced in that courtroom, that night I had a huge panic attack. Fainted, threw up everywhere. I completely lost it. I just couldn't believe any of this. And that's when I started going on antidepressants. yeah, it's had its effects. I'm very, very different from what I was. I don't feel anything for my sisters anymore.
Susan Johnson told me that her elderly mother, Margaret, hadn't responded to any of her letters or the 180-page manuscript that she'd sent her pleading her case. And for years, Rebecca had refused to contact her grandmother because she was still haunted by the memory of being arrested and charged after she encountered her sister Emily stranded on a country road. Rebecca had come to believe that any approach she made could be misconstrued and derail her parents' legal appeals. But then, late last year, Rebecca did finally send her grandmother a greeting for her birthday. And she got a reply. And after that, they had a long conversation on the phone, and Rebecca told me her grandmother had admitted that she now had serious doubts about the case. She was questioning things that Sarah and Emily had told her. I broke this news to Susan Johnson over the prison phone line. There's been possibly quite a significant development in that she actually called your mother.
Oh, God. Thank God. I did tell her yesterday I was very upset. She could tell I was very upset on my mum's birthday, and I said it possibly. Sorry, I'm just really emotional. Yeah. I'm shaking, actually. I know from experience not to, believe anything will go anywhere until it actually does. But personally, this is a big development.
If Susan Johnson's mother now had doubts, I wanted to hear about that myself. After all, her testimony had helped put her daughter in prison. And several months after she first spoke to Rebecca, Margaret agreed to talk to me. So earlier this year, I went to the neat home she shares with her partner and 2 elderly dogs in coastal New South Wales. Like nearly everyone in the podcast, Margaret can't be identified, and I wasn't even sure, as we sat at her kitchen table, whether she would agree to be quoted. We'd already had a previous meeting in which she wouldn't even let me take any notes. I wanted to ask you just some questions to try and sort out in my mind what happened when. If I wanted to use something you'd said and I got someone else to speak that in the podcast, would that be all right? So it's said in another woman's voice but not your voice. Margaret agreed to that. So the words you're about to hear are hers, even though the voice isn't and some names have been changed. I learned quickly that although she is a very senior citizen and sometimes jumbles dates and names, Margaret could be extremely forthright. She told me emphatically that she didn't believe her daughter Susan was capable of sexually abusing her daughters, and nor did she believe her granddaughter Emily's stories of being raped and tortured in the shed next to the family home for years on end. She said she knew that shed, how open it was, and how close it was to the house.
The girls would have had to go past there. You walk down, they would go swimming down there. It was a wire shed. There was nothing. There was no way a girl could be locked up in there for days and nobody else knows.
But if that was the case, why had Margaret agreed to be a key prosecution witness? She explained that she had known hardly anything about the allegations against her daughter and son-in-law until after the trial. She knew Emily and Sarah were accusing their father of some kind of sexual assault, but they had never revealed any details, and she had no idea that the sisters were also accusing their mother. So Margaret had never understood why Susan Johnson was standing by her husband, and she had cut her off. Then police had told her not to contact her daughter and even suggested her life might be in danger. She remembered being advised to move out of home for a few days at one point and live with her daughter Philippa. Nor did police tell her that because she was a family member, she didn't have to testify. She only found that out when she was standing in the witness box, feeling so tense that she actually snapped her spectacles in half while the judge was speaking to her.
It was the shock of seeing the judge there and Susan and Martin over there and Susan next to him. I thought, what the heck is going on here? Each one had their own barrister. I was already in the stand when the judge said, "You realise before we go ahead that you've got the option to stop it all and you'll be excused." I was thinking, why wouldn't the police tell me that?
So Margaret had given her evidence in which she described her son-in-law's sometimes brutal discipline and the incident she remembered when she saw her granddaughters massaging their naked father in her home. We've covered that in previous episodes. It's an allegation that was first made to police by Sarah Johnson, and it's flatly denied by her sister Rebecca. I had always wondered whether police had helped jog Margaret's memory before she gave her statement, but she insisted that wasn't the case. She did tell me, however, that it was only after Martin and Susan Johnson went to prison that she learned from newspaper reports about the horrendous crimes they were said to have committed. At first, Margaret had accepted it must be true. This had been a criminal trial, after all. There had been medical evidence. She decided that she'd never really known her daughter Susan, that their whole relationship had been a lie. But she was puzzled that Emily could have suffered such brutal sexual violence for so long and yet still have such an active romantic life. She recalled that only a week after Emily split up with Sam, she had a new boyfriend who became her fiancé. And then, not long after breaking off that engagement, she had moved in with Dave Miller, the police officer. And Margaret began to see another side to her granddaughter. She said Emily confided over dinner one night that she felt guilty about what she had done to her parents because she had enjoyed it.
That was shocking. That was already when she was older, when she was talking as a young woman. The power she had over her mum, and that she felt terrible to have felt like that at times. And Emily adored her mum. I found that so hard. I mean, you can be angry with someone, but not make statements like that.
And then last year, Emily called her after finding out that her grandmother had been speaking to Rebecca for the first time in a decade.
It was very shrewd words, very cleverly said, and she just attacked me. "You're out of the family if you mix with her." I said, "Emily, do you know who you're speaking to?" The way she talked to me. To be so normal one moment and talk to your grandmother like that after the relationship we had for 30 years. This is not normal, but she's not crazy either. She's calculating. That's how I felt after that conversation. It just totally shattered me.
What really shocked Margaret, however, was when I told her that Emily's sister Sarah had been molested by Bill Newman when she was young, and that Sarah had gone to police about that before she ever accused her father of similar crimes. Margaret was dumbfounded. She said, "You're joking," because she knew nothing about it, even though she and Sarah had been close for years. She remembered Bill Newman very well because during the time that Newman was living with the girls and their mother, Margaret and her husband had moved in for a while. They had witnessed Sarah's sexualised behaviour at the time. Her grandfather became so uncomfortable, he moved out. Margaret remembered Newman's remarks about how beautiful the girls were, how he would drop gifts off to Emily at school, and how he made comments that played Sarah off against her mother.
He was strange. He would say, "What a beautiful girl." And I thought, Jesus, I don't know about you being a friend of the family. The fuss he made with the girls. That makes so much sense, what you're saying there. And knowing Sarah, it explains so much about her personality over the years, the poor girl. Why she gets anxiety attacks. The behaviour between the two of them was weird, but we just thought it was a teenage fascination.
Margaret told me that she had even mentioned her concerns about Newman to Sarah's father, who was separated from his wife at the time. And then, after Susan Johnson kicked Newman out of the house and reconciled with her husband, Newman had started visiting Margaret at her home. He gave her a letter to give to Sarah after she turned 21, and his fixation on the family made her uncomfortable. But she had never had any idea that he'd molested Sarah, and that knowledge changed her whole perspective on the case.
How come I knew nothing about that? It wasn't Martin who taught the girl. That's what it sounds like to me. Because if that seed was planted by this child molester, which he was, my God, the whole thing would have gone a different way. Why didn't Susan talk to me about it? I knew him very well, and that makes me just throw up. He was a sicko, that guy. That absolutely takes it out of me, the stuff you've told me. It really comes to a point what actually did happen. There's so many question marks in it. Even like now, like bringing the family together. It seems to be as far, far away as anything. It seems to get worse.
I spent 7 hours talking to Margaret, and I learned that a lot of the things she believed or had been told about the case were simply not true. She said Sarah had told her that Daniel was living with bikies, and she seemed to believe that Martin Johnson had once conducted sex parties with his children in an apartment. One of many allegations I had to tell her was untrue. It was as if the case was so horrific, it had developed its own mythology. Everyone in the family had their own version of the truth. Margaret thanked me for the information I'd given her, but when I spoke to her a week later, she was having trouble sleeping. She felt she'd been misled about the court case, used for a purpose she never intended, and she'd found out Emily was back in hospital. I had contacted Emily and Sarah, asking to speak to them for the podcast. Now Margaret's daughter Philippa was upset, and Margaret didn't want to talk about the case anymore. She thought that if she rekindled contact with her daughter Susan in prison, she risked losing her relationship with Sarah and Emily, and maybe even with her other daughter. It was an impossible dilemma. That question Margaret had asked me, what actually did happen, I couldn't answer her. Whenever I fixed a picture of the case in my mind, something came along to dislodge it. I was rifling through some documents Rebecca had sent me one day when I came across some handwritten notes Martin Johnson had sent his lawyer from prison before his trial. In them, he mentioned an incident that had happened when he'd been massaging Rebecca. He said he'd become aroused, which was involuntary and embarrassing, and he'd quickly stopped the massage. But Rebecca had noticed, so he had to acknowledge it and discuss it with her and her mother. This was the incident that Sarah had brought up with her father during the secretly recorded call that we heard in episode 5.
Her hand on your penis. Like, well, how am I meant to think about this?
Although in Sarah's version, she said she had seen her father place Rebecca's hand on his penis.
I went down and I tried to say to my own mother what was going on, and I've tried so many times to go to Mum and tell her what's happened as well.
Rebecca and her parents had always told me that Sarah's account was a fiction, but it turned out something had actually happened. When I went back to Rebecca to ask some uncomfortable questions about this, she acknowledged the incident. She said no one else had witnessed it, but it had been discussed in the family, and that was when their father's sports massages had stopped.
We spoke openly about that in a discussion too, and then but it was never, after that we never had a treatment again. But it wasn't an issue in the sense that it was an open discussion. It was completely stopped at that point.
I hadn't been told this story before, and I could see why. It made it easier to believe that Martin Johnson did have a sexual interest in his daughters, and at the very least, his massages might have crossed a line that left them disturbed. And how could Susan Johnson have known about this incident and her husband's history as a teacher, and yet still steadfastly refused to believe he'd done anything wrong? I had to put that to her in one of our last conversations. One of the things that sort of puzzles me is why you found it so unlikely that, did you not think there's any possibility that was in fact sort of doing massages which were inappropriate?
Absolutely not, because we were a very close family, and these girls, I was there all the time, and they would have told me that was. You have to understand. I know what's being said, but we were inseparable as a family, and there was not one single indicator, and I just knew or believed. And no, I never, ever, ever suspected anything. And if I had it, again, I would have gone straight to him. I mean, I would have. What reason did I have to protect this man? And listen, you've got to also understand, I left my husband. we were separated, legally separated for 1 year. You know, they knew my stand about him being away all the time, and they knew they came first to me.
More than once, Susan Johnson had said to me that she wished she had suspected something or known of something that she could have told police about, that the only reason she was in prison was because she had nothing to offer them but the truth as she saw it, that her husband was completely innocent. But something had happened to turn Emily and Sarah against their parents. The image that stayed with me from the whole case was that selfie the two sisters had taken the day they denounced their mother and father as monsters in the district court. They looked so proud and happy. At their trial, the Johnsons' lawyers had tried to argue that Sarah and Emily were simply lying, without offering an explanation of why two daughters who once appeared to love their parents would turn on them with such fury. The jury didn't buy it, and I couldn't blame them. But the explanation the jury did believe was the one I found the least convincing, that Martin Johnson was a sadistic sexual torturer, cleverly disguised as an ordinary family man, that his wife had been his willing accomplice, that he'd chosen as his torture chamber a dilapidated chook shed within earshot of his children's bedrooms, and that his daughter Emily had miraculously survived more than a decade of life-threatening injuries without realising that what her dad was doing was wrong, and without anyone at all noticing. What I could see was a family made up of combustible elements, a father who could be domineering and harsh, 3 daughters competing against each other for his approval as a parent and as a coach. One of those girls already sexually abused by a trusted family friend, another unraveling under the pressure of pursuing Olympic dreams, and hovering in the background, their father's own shadowy past. It seemed likely that Emily's counsellors had found out about that before she did, and became convinced that her father was the source of her problems. And when she herself found out, after months of being questioned about her father, it triggered an explosion of memories that were seemingly recovered in states of delirium and dissociation. If that was how it happened, Martin Johnson's past had come back to haunt him with a vengeance. When I told him I was going to report some of what Fiona had told me about his conduct as a teacher, his answer almost sounded like an admission of culpability. Almost.
As I've said before, I made mistakes. I'm always happy to put my hand up if I've made mistakes. Someone else has come forward and says, okay, I had a relationship with them or whatever. I'll face that if and when the time comes, and deal with it as best I can and as honestly as I can. I'm not beyond making mistakes. People out there who still, all these years later, feel that I did the wrong thing, then okay, that's sorted out. I was a good teacher. But, be it the 80s or whatever, I can't justify it on the terms of an era or a time, but it was, I overstepped the mark, and I know that. That was me in the 80s, anyway.
The Johnsons haven't quite exhausted all their legal appeals. Convicted criminals in New South Wales can apply for a judicial review of their case. It's an avenue that's currently being pursued by one of Susan Johnson's fellow inmates, Kathleen Folbig, who was jailed 20 years ago for the murders of 3 of her children. To earn a judicial review, you need significant evidence of a miscarriage of justice, and public pressure also helps. Kathleen Folbig has the backing of broadcaster Alan Jones and 100 eminent scientists who have contested the medical evidence that was used to convict her. Convicted paedophiles have considerably less public support. But the Johnson case is attracting the attention of a growing number of mental health experts and lawyers. One of those troubled by it is John Stratton, the senior counsel who conducted the High Court appeal for Martin Johnson.
Look, I've been working in criminal law since the early 1980s, so around about 40 years. And I'm a big fan of the jury system. I think juries nearly always get it right, but sometimes they do get it wrong, and sometimes appeal courts get it wrong. And I think this is one of those cases.
A judicial review won't mend the Johnson family, of course, and it's not clear how that might ever happen. More than a decade after Emily Johnson first sought help in a psychiatric ward, she is still being hospitalised, 3 times in the last year alone. She did complete another university degree, but then months later, police reported her missing for the second time in 2 years. When I last spoke to her grandmother, Margaret, she said doctors were trying new treatments. Margaret herself struggles now with what to believe and finds herself caught between the divided factions of the family. In jail, Susan Johnson exercises 5 hours a day with the same discipline and focus she once applied to running in the forests near her home. In her 3x4 metre cell, locked away in protective custody, she performs up to 1,000 push-ups a day. In her segregated exercise area, she walks 15 to 20 kilometres. She refuses all drugs, even paracetamol. She told me she remains focused on the possibility of release and a future in which she is somehow reunited with all her children.
And that's why it is difficult to talk about my past, because I had so many ambitions, and my family was my world, and now this, and it's just this for years and years and years. It seems with no end in sight. During jail, very, very hard, what they call very, very difficult in a maximum security prison. And I try not to let that consume me, but when I'm asked, as you just asked me, yes, both physically and emotionally, it is torture and suffering, and in particular when you're an innocent woman. And the whole system is geared for punishment. The whole system is that you learn from your crime. You're constantly told, you've done the wrong thing. And it is very difficult to hear that over and over and over when you know you've done nothing and you don't even know why you're here. I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of reflection, I do a lot of mind work. Everything I do is for myself. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing it. It's very, very difficult. And I have very, very dark days, but that's the way I'm getting through this prison sentence. I will not speak to any psychiatric nurse or psychologist because of I'm in here because of that. I'm in here because I took my daughter to a mental health facility to get help, and I don't trust anyone. I don't trust anyone. Police, guards, lawyers, the justice system. My faith is shot. I will do what's required of me, but I will never, ever, ever admit any remorse or guilt just to get myself out of here early, or anything else for that matter. And yes, I've been told that once it comes to parole, it's difficult when you still don't plead, any guilt. But to me, that would be lying. That would be worse. And that's just never going to be an option. And, and people even in here have said to me, well, why don't you just give up? What keeps you going? And what keeps me going is truth. And that's all I have left. They've taken absolutely everything else from me. And it's just to get the truth known and to give my family, every member of my family, the chance to pick these pieces up and move forward the best way they can, and hopefully have a future.
When I started investigating what had happened to the Johnsons more than 5 years ago, it was because I'd seen cases like this before, involving mental illness, extraordinary allegations of abuse, and memories retrieved in counselling. All these cases are different, of course, and I told myself I didn't know what had gone on in this family, and I probably never would. Still, every journalist likes to think they'll get to the bottom of things, that dogged research will lead them to a conclusion. But in this case, the opposite happened. Each layer of the story loosened my grip on certainty. Only this week, I discovered something new about Emily Johnson, that after her parents went to prison, She had sued the Queensland government for compensation, claiming that her post-traumatic stress disorder was caused not by the savage abuse she'd suffered at home, but by the sexual assault she'd experienced overseas at 17. Her parents had started that lawsuit back when Emily first entered the mental health system, and she had kept fighting it for 10 years and moved it interstate. Someone familiar with the case told me that she'd been demanding more than $1 million in compensation before she finally settled for a 5-figure sum. So now I'm pursuing that thread, knowing there's no time because we're already at the end of the podcast. This is the part of the story where the narrator is supposed to tie all the loose ends together and come up with a satisfying resolution. Except this isn't one of those stories. This is a podcast about doubt. And when people ask me, what do you think? I don't have a simple answer. Do I believe Martin Johnson is a wholly innocent man and that it's unthinkable he would have sexually assaulted his daughters? Well, no. Do I think Susan Johnson has told me the unvarnished truth about her family? Maybe not. But nor do I think that their daughter Emily got the mental health treatment she deserved in her moment of need. I don't believe the police investigated her allegations diligently and thoroughly. And I don't think the Johnsons received a fair trial. These are uncomfortable things to say at a time when women are insisting that they be believed, and when so much hidden sexual abuse is being uncovered. The Me Too movement and the church paedophile scandals have shown us how disbelief hurt victims in the past. And yet doubt has to have its place in this debate. After all, it's how we strive to keep innocent people out of prison. If there is reasonable doubt that they committed a particular crime, the accused must be acquitted. In the Johnson case, the jury's belief overwhelmed their doubt. But was justice served? And does this guilty verdict tell us that the balance has swung too far one way in sexual assault cases? A father was consigned to jail until the end of his life, and a mother will remain in prison until her 60s, all on the basis of evidence that one judge, at least, described as implausible and improbable. We're all drawn to stories of evil, and Martin and Susan Johnson were turned into its incarnation in court, monsters in our midst. Are they really monsters, or is the truth murkier and more complicated? The test in our courts is not whether we find someone morally dubious or suspicious or unpleasant. The test is guilt beyond reasonable doubt. And for that system to work, we have to embrace doubt and not push it aside.
Shadow of Doubt is a podcast investigation from The Australian. It's written and presented by Richard Guilliatt and produced and mixed by our multimedia editor, Lia Tsamoglou. I'm editorial director Claire Harvey, host of our daily news podcast, The Front, where you'll hear our journalists talking candidly about their stories. You can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. Just say, play the news from The Australian to hear the latest episode. Subscribe to our channel CrimeX Plus on Apple Podcasts or search The Australian wherever you get your podcasts. And you can check out all our journalism anytime at theaustralian.com.au.